welcome back. In the last section, we discussed the historic influence of sheep grazing and other factors on Icelandic landscapes. We are now in a better position to understand the current impacts of sheep grazing. In this section, we will discuss current management practices, the laws regulating these practices, and current research efforts to monitor and investigate environmental impacts of sheep in Iceland. Finally, we will discuss the sustainability of these practices. First, let's take a look at the current grazing systems in Iceland today and how they are regulated. To talk about grazing systems, we have Jóhann Thorsson from the Soil Conservation Service of Iceland. And to introduce some of the laws and regulations relevant to sheep grazing, we have Björn Helgi Barkarsson from the Ministry of Environment and Natural Resources.
Sheep grazing in Iceland is an important cultural activity that has influenced traditional livelihoods. Farms are scattered all over the country and are the backbone of many rural communities. The Icelandic sheep breed is one of the Northern European short-tailed sheep. It's a hardy breed, not the most productive, but it can withstand the harsh climate conditions of Iceland and yields wool, meat and milk, although sheep dairy products are not common today. For the most part, the Icelandic sheep descends from the sheep that the first settlers brought with them from Norway, and it's a well-preserved breed. When a sheep leaves Iceland, it cannot come back again. Sheep cannot return to Iceland mostly because of diseases. There were 2 diseases that came from abroad that decimated the numbers of sheep in Iceland. The sheep scab, which came both in the 18th and 19th century, and the Maidvisna disease in the 20th century. Sheep farming systems are very similar across the Nordic regions. Essentially, there is an interfeeding period during winter and an outdoor grazing season during the summer. In the early days, before mechanization, things were different. There was not enough hay, so sheep were commonly grazed in winter and only housed overnight in small sheds. This practice had a damaging impact on vegetation, especially on woody species. And nowadays, sheep are kept indoors during the winter. In the spring, sheep are grazed on cultivated fields close to the farms until the adult females, the ewes, and their lambs are released into their summer ranges, often into the highlands. Most local farming communities have grazing rights to the commons. The extent of the commons is very variable. They range from less than 100 square kilometers to more than 5,000 square kilometers. Commons are usually limited by natural boundaries, large rivers, glaciers, or high mountain ranges, but fences are also used. The sheep are grazed in the commons from late June to mid-September without herding. Generally, what you see in the rangeland in Iceland is a mother with 1 to 3 lambs, usually 2, or a mother with an adult daughter and their lambs. You don't see the big herds that are common with other sheep breeds of the world. And as fall approaches, the sheep are rounded up. This has become a hugely popular event all over Iceland, the réttir, when the sheep are brought back from the summer ranges to the farms. Summer grazing in the commons is a cost-effective practice. Lambs gain weight quickly, especially in the early and mid-summer. However, there are problems associated with this practice. The summer rangeland condition is not properly assessed, and little adjustments are made in terms of grazing pressure. Grazing management practices, including the length of the grazing period and stocking densities, vary between commons and are decided by the district councils. In many cases, the rangelands have been used to their absolute limits. After decades and centuries of this management strategy, many rangelands are in poor condition, but the tradition is strong and we tend to do things as they have been done before. Of course, we are trying to move towards sustainable land use, but finding the right stocking rates, how many animals we can have per unit area, and adjusting them within and between years is difficult. Ideally, we should base our decisions on the carrying capacity of the rangelands, but that is equally hard to achieve because plant productivity varies a lot between and within years. In other words, we really never know what is the carrying capacity at a given point of time. For example, if we have a cold summer, plant productivity will not be as high as in a warm summer, so carrying capacity will consequently be reduced. And if we have several cold summers in a row, vegetation will not have time to recover and the carrying capacity will be severely reduced. The only way around this is to be very conservative in estimating stocking rates so that we do not deplete the vegetation resource.
Laws concerning grazing, vegetation and soil in Iceland, except from some minor amendments, have not changed since 1965. A livestock quota was introduced in the 1980s and the number of sheep has since reduced by half. The number of sheep farms has somewhat decreased. Many farmers still keep a low number of sheep, from 10 to 100 heads, but the number of large farms with more than 800 heads has increased during the last years. This may have changed the grazing intensity in some areas. Sheep products today are mostly meat and wool. Domestic consumption of meat has been declining for a number of years, but the number of sheep is maintained by export. The last few years, more than 30% of the total production has been exported. Agricultural subsidies are a substantial proportion of Iceland's national budget, and sheep farming cannot sustain itself without subsidies. Subsidies are provided as direct payments to the farmers, and they represent about half of the income of the sheep production industry. In the year 2000, sheep farmers and the government made a landmark agreement that tied production subsidies to quality management. Sustainable land use is part of the criteria for this quality management. Each farmer is supposed to have enough grazing land in good condition available to his livestock so that his grazing management can be considered sustainable. However, the rules allow grazing on land in bad condition if the farmer develops a land improvement plan. Generally, these plans include a land rehabilitation program and some management objectives, but still, grazing of areas in poor condition is continued. Given the current state of many rangelands in Iceland, it would be advisable to enforce regulations to prevent or at least strongly reduce sheep grazing in some areas, especially within the volcanic active zone.
Sheep densities in Iceland are nowadays half of what they used to be in the early 1980s, and some of the most damaging grazing practices, like winter grazing, have been abandoned. However, many of the rangelands are in relatively poor condition after decades of overgrazing and extensive soil erosion, and current policies still favor increased numbers of sheep through providing subsidies. For sheep grazing to be sustainable, policies should link financial support to sustainable carrying capacity, which must take into account the extent and productivity of the grazing land. As well, the development of sustainable grazing practices requires that we consider ecological, social, and economic aspects. In the next section, we will discuss what we know about the ecological part.